is the only referee that we're able to use, that we're allowed to use, so you have to go with their numbers. But I think it's important to look historically. They've been off on health care estimations a lot over the years, I would say, and on other things, but that's the scorekeeper you have. Under Obamacare, they said it was going to reduce the deficit. It increased it. Under Obamacare, they said it was going to lower costs. Cost increased. Regardless of that, we know our bill is going to lower the deficit. We know our bill is going to give families the choices that they want to make in health care. But also, the CBO cannot look at all the other things that we're doing. They can't look at what Secretary Tom Price can and is doing over at HHS. They can't look at the other bills that we're going to move, like allowing people to buy insurance across state lines. So you have to look at this package in totality to look at how it's going to actually restore health care freedom for families, put them in charge of their decisions, and ultimately lower costs for premiums, which is most important to families that are struggling under the ballooning, skyrocketing increases in health care that we're seeing under Obamacare.
What's the answer to Rand Paul saying that this is more Medicaid expansion?
Well, first of all, we actually give flexibility back to the states in Medicaid. It doesn't affect Medicare. But Medicaid, we transform that system. If you look, probably the most broken form of health care is Medicaid. For decades, conservatives have been saying we want to actually restore flexibility to governors so that states can run the Medicaid program instead of this one-size-fits-all Washington model that's failed. We do that in this bill. It's a revolutionary conservative reform. You know, maybe some people want to stick to the old Medicaid system, but I'll tell you, anybody that's looked at Medicaid has said it's the most broken form of a very broken health care system.
What's the likelihood that you get all of this done on time and we actually do see a tax reform package in place by August? It feels like you and your colleagues have been trying to take expectations down. We know the markets are expecting tax reform. That's why they're up 15% since Election Day. But will it actually materialize in 2017?
It needs to materialize, Maria, and if you know this very well. Right now our tax code is uncompetitive. It's too complex. We have the highest corporate tax rate in the world, and it's costing us jobs in America. We want to bring those jobs back. President Trump wants to bring those jobs back, and that's something we're going to do right after we do this step to repeal or replace Obamacare, and we're on track to do it. Look, we had a very exhaustive set of hearings. I was on the Energy and Commerce Committee. We went for 27.5 hours. They say it might be the longest meeting in a congressional meeting in history of Congress. But we beat the Democrats on every amendment. They had every amendment that they wanted to offer, and it was a very philosophical battle. Conservatives versus liberals on health care policy. Should Washington run health care decisions, or should families and doctors make those decisions? And it was a very clear set of lines. It's actually fun to get back to the basic fight on health care. Should the government be making the decisions, or should you make the decisions for your family? We won on that front. Every Republican voted yes. Every Democrat voted no when we got the bill out.
Let me ask you about the budget coming up this week. Last week we spoke with Budget Director, OMB head Mick Mulvaney, who basically laid out the priorities. Listen to what he told us last Sunday. He emphasized defense as a place where we will see the money, and he emphasized law and order as well as school choice. But now we're understanding that the president would like to fund the wall on the southern border with cuts to the TSA, FEMA, and the Coast Guard. Does the public have that right?
Yes, and look, these are all things that President Trump ran on. Again, I think it's something very refreshing to see that you have a President, Donald Trump, who has been following through in his first 50 days on all of the things that he promised he would do when he ran for office. Liberals are going nuts because they didn't want that to happen. They didn't vote for him, but the rest of the country did and wants to see this happen. So having it reflected in the budget, I think, is the next step in following through on those promises. And we're going to be working hard in the House to make sure we can fulfill those things. Those are things we all want to do. Strengthen defense, strengthen America's national security, secure our border, which is such an important point to do. And obviously President Trump laid out those details of how he wants to secure the border and build the wall, and we're going to work with him to get it done.
All right, we'll look for further details come Wednesday with the budget release. Congressman, good to see you. Thanks so much, sir.
Great being back, Maria.
Congressman Steve Scalise joining us there. With a big hearing coming up, Democrats are trying to tie the White House to Russia over and over again. But are the attacks simply a witch hunt? Senate panel Intel Committee member Roy Blunt joins us live next. A Sunday Morning Futures exclusive ahead. Commerce Secretary Wilbur Ross on the future of NAFTA and jobs in America. Back in a moment.
The right way to negotiate NAFTA is in conference rooms with Mexico and Canada, not, frankly, in the press room.
good to have you on the program. Thank you so much for joining us.
Morning, Maria. It's nice to be with you.
What do we know at this point? It feels like when I watch the mainstream media, it's all about, well, we haven't found the collusion evidence yet, but we're still watching.
Well, exactly. I was out at the CIA headquarters on Friday. I was there a week ago. I think I was the first member to get a chance last week to go through the documents that the Obama administration had. And, you know, when General Clapper, the former head of the Defense, the National Intelligence Agency, last week was asked about that, he said, we have seen no evidence of collusion, but we ought to be sure that that's the case. This has become a big enough issue that at the end of what the House does, at the end of what the Senate does, I think it's very important that everybody can walk away thinking that everybody that should have been talked to was talked to, that everything that should have been looked at was looked at. That's the best thing for the president. It's the best thing for the country. And so we need to be pretty relentless in looking at anything that's there. But, you know, General Clapper's made the most definitive public statement on that so far, and that was no evidence of any collusion between the campaign and the Russians. That doesn't mean the Russians weren't involved in our elections, because we know that they were.
As part of this investigation, are you also investigating these claims of wiretapping of Trump Tower during the election?
Well, the president's asked the Congress to look at that, which is, I think, interesting, since the president actually could himself ask that question. But we should look at how people were listened to. The Flynn case, I think we all believe now that that's because that the FBI was listening to the Russian ambassador and caught that conversation with General Flynn. But that's not an unfair question to ask, and we should know. And of course, that would indicate what the FBI and the CIA were looking at and when they were looking at it. And important to get an answer to that question as well.
In fact, Attorney General Jeff Sessions, in an interview just last week, said that he would be open to a special prosecutor to investigate the Obama administration scandals, including things like the IRS targeting scandal. What do you make of that?
Well, I think there's a reason that the special prosecutor law was repealed. The Congress would have to reinstate the ability to have an actual special prosecutor. It doesn't say that that doesn't say that the Attorney General can't assign a particular individual to pursue a particular case, but really you only want to look at a special prosecutor, in my view, if nobody's looking at this. A few years ago we had a case where nobody in the Obama administration was looking at a situation, and I and others said, well, this is a last resort, but nobody's looking. Here you've got both a bipartisan House committee, a bipartisan Senate committee looking into this, and I think we ought to be sure we let that process work before we decide if anything else needs to be done or not. And if we do our job right, the decision should be by Democrats and Republicans both that everything that's been looked at has been looked at, and we can move on.
Well, I mean, it's no secret, certainly to the American people, that many of these agencies have become so politicized, whether it be the Department of Justice, the IRS, and people want to know if, in fact, all of the above has been looked at. I mean, where does that stand? You've got the IRS scandal, you've got Fast and Furious, you've got Secretary Clinton's server, the Department of Justice having come under some great criticism over the last year.
Well, I think it's important that we get to the bottom of things that we're looking at. I think it's also important we not spend an inordinate amount of time looking at the last administration. Other countries spend a lot of time trying to find out what the last administration did wrong.
Right.
We need to be getting to where we're focused on this administration getting things right. And this is not some small republic where you spend your time trying to figure out how to put the previous people that had these jobs in jail.
Sure.
But we need to get this particular issue of Russians in our elections right. I think there's a general view, Maria, that Russians right now, perhaps in the Netherlands, certainly in Germany and France are involving themselves in those elections as they have over and over again in Eastern European elections. And one of the things we can do here is help other countries get prepared for this in a better way by doing this job right. That's why it matters.
I think you make a great point, particularly now, given the fact that you guys are working on an enormous agenda. You want to get Obamacare repealed and replaced, then you want to do tax reform and a whole host of other things on the president's agenda. Has this taken your attention away from the issues at hand?
Well, I think that it has taken away from what we need to be doing, just like the slow walking of allowing the president to get his team in place at these departments has taken away from that agenda. Everybody knows the importance of the first 200 days, the time between the inauguration and, say, Labor Day, and every one of those days you lose is a precious day in terms of what we can do to really get families to have the health coverage they need and people back to work, to the kind of jobs that can make stronger individuals and stronger families.
Yeah, and we've all watched the delays in the confirmation hearings. Senator, good to see you, sir. Thanks so much.
Good to see you.
We'll see you soon. Senator Roy Blunt. President Trump looks to make good on that promise to build a border wall between the U.S. and Mexico. Wilbur Ross on deck. Stay with us. Commerce Secretary coming up. Say Chief Admiral James Loy. He's also a former Deputy Secretary of Homeland Security. Sir, it's good to have you on the program. Thanks so much for joining us.
Morning, Maria. Nice to be with you.
Talk to us about the challenges that you and some of your colleagues have faced at the border in terms of the budget that we are expecting this week and the expected cuts to things like TSA. Can you characterize the situation at hand right now in terms of challenges?
Well, I think it's a very real challenge, and part of it is just lining up the budget activity against the policy rhetoric of the administration. I think we all are absolutely delighted that the president is going to upgrade the strength of our national security envelope, but there needs to be a recognition that the national security envelope in the wake of 9/11 does include the Coast Guard and agencies within DHS. It's not just the 4 DoD services. By law, the Coast Guard is the 5th armed service of the United States, and the idea of cutting agencies that are contributing to border security at the same time you're trying to strengthen border security needs to be just dealt with a little more constructively. And I think the budget passback process is one of the tools to use to make that happen.
So there was a draft proposal from the Office of Management and Budget, which says that the Coast Guard's budget would be pared by $1.3 billion. Spending on the Transportation Security Administration, TSA, and FEMA would get sliced by $900 million. Now, candidate Trump, of course, promised to build this southern wall, and you have to have a way to pay for that. So how would you expect things to change at TSA as a result of budget cuts that we're expecting to be announced this week?
Well, if those budget cuts were sustained, the challenge is what happens at the borders, whether the wall is there or not. And if, in fact, the wall was even built, the natural extensions of the wall to the Gulf of California on the west and to the Gulf of Mexico on the east is all maritime provinces where the Coast Guard is the principal law enforcement and national security agency to deal with what goes on there. So at the moment, the Coast Guard, for example, is intercepting at sea some 200 tons of drugs every year. 6,000 illegal migrants are collected at sea before they even reach those borders. So to take away the capability to make constructive progress in the very areas that you're looking to sustain makes little sense if you're cutting the agencies that are actually doing that. And as it relates to national security itself, the 5th armed service of this country, the Coast Guard, is making significant contributions in CENTCOM. Ask the 5th Fleet commander what they can do without the unique capabilities of boarding and dealing with the oil rigs in the Gulf of, or in the Persian Gulf.
Yeah.
Ask the Southcom commander, now the new Secretary of Homeland Security, what were the kind of ships that put to sea in his Navy, so to speak, in Southcom. They were all white ships with stripes on them. They were not Navy gray hulls. So there just needs to be a learning curve dealt with here to recognize the legitimacy of these kinds of contributions to the very thing the president wants to strengthen.
So is there something that you want to make sure must have in that budget come Wednesday, given that you've been on the front lines?
Well, I think without a doubt, the strengthening of border agents, which is in the budget, is good. The bed count with regard to dealing with the collection of illegal agents in the deportation efforts is very good. But the Coast Guard's budget and the TSA budget need to be sustained at levels that allow the growth and modernization of their capabilities, both in the airports around this country and at sea, as the Coast Guard deals with not only the things I've already spoken about, but the port security realities where 9,000 inspections of incoming foreign vessels, which sustain over $3 trillion worth of commerce for this country, are guaranteed by the Coast Guard on an annual basis. It's just not the time to cut that budget.
All right, we will be watching that. Admiral James Alloy, good to see you. Thanks so much for your insights, sir.
Thank you, Maria.
We will be watching the budget, American jobs, the future of NAFTA, all of that in my exclusive interview coming up live right here with Commerce Secretary Wilbur Ross as we look ahead on Sunday Morning Futures. That's next. Welcome back. President Trump's budget plan set to take center stage this upcoming week. White House Budget Director Mick Mulvaney announced he expects to unveil the federal budget Wednesday, setting the stage for a battle over where that money should go. Joining me right now for Sunday Morning Futures exclusive is Commerce Secretary Wilbur Ross. Secretary Ross, great to see you.
Good to see you,
Thank you so much for joining us. And we've been talking about your confirmation for a lot of weeks right now.
Too many.
It was way too many. You're in place. Let me ask you about priorities in your office right now.
Enforcement, number one. And you might have seen about a week ago we announced the highest fine ever, highest civil and criminal penalties on ZTE for violating the Iranian sanctions and exporting sensitive goods to North Korea. We fined them $1.19 billion, a real record fine, and it sends a message. Enforcement is a major priority of the Commerce Department now.
ZTE doing business with Iran. This is a Chinese company?
Chinese company, yes.
Right, so, okay.
Chinese owned.
Yeah, so it's Chinese owned, and they're doing deals with Iran. How difficult is that when you have to put a levy on a company, but it's also connected to the Chinese government? It opens a bigger ball of wax.
Well, they confessed to their wrongdoing. They actually made, after they were under the investigation by Commerce's Bureau of Industrial Security, they made 283 more shipments to North Korea. They were erasing emails every single day to try to cover their tracks, and then we nailed them, and they've admitted it, and there'll be more such cases, not just on export, but we're going to enforce imports as well.
Wow, this is a big deal.
There are billions of dollars of countervailing duties that have been imposed but never collected. We want to stop that.
Why? It's amazing to me when you look at the laws in place that were just blown off for the last several years.
Yeah, well, when you think about it, it's so hard bringing a trade case and so hard winning it. It's really absurd that you don't make sure you're going to be able to collect the fines at the end of the day. So all that's going to be fixed.
All right, we want to talk about the priorities around trade, and certainly Mexico is one of your big priorities. You've said that many times. But this week we're talking about the budget. Here's what Mick Mulvaney told me last Sunday in terms of the president's priorities, what we'll hear this Wednesday. Watch this.
The priorities are exactly what the priorities that the president set out during the campaign. He said he wanted to spend more money on defense. He said he wanted to spend more money on immigration enforcement. He said he wanted to spend more money on enforcing the laws that are already on the books. He said he wanted to spend more money on school choice. And he said he wanted to do that without adding any additional money to the deficit this year. And that's what we have been spending our time on, and that's what we'll be delivering next week.
So connect the dots for us in terms of what your office is working on as it relates to trade and commerce.
Well, we might have seen we had a press conference end of last week with my counterpart from Mexico. And to try to lower the temperature a little bit, we delayed certain actions we were going to take against the dumping of Mexican sugar into this market. And that was meant to be a goodwill gesture before we get going on NAFTA, because 2 million Mexicans work in the sugar industry.
All right.
A huge, huge employer there.
So talk to us about what you'd like to see change in terms of NAFTA. Have you begun discussions about a bilateral trade agreement between the U.S. and Mexico?
We haven't made a decision yet as to whether the form should be a continuation of a trilateral, which it is now, or 2 parallel and symmetrical bilaterals. Right now, we're thinking about substance rather than form.
Okay, so then we could actually see the trilateral U.S., Mexico, Canada stay in place, only with different terms.
It could be. I don't think the important thing is the form. The important thing is the substance.
Let's talk about the substance, because what really strikes me when I look at NAFTA is the idea that this law became the template for all deals, the World Trade Organization deals. I mean, and so if a company thought, well, I could go produce my products in Mexico for a lot cheaper than I would in the U.S. and then sell it to the U.S., no problem, free trade, of course they're going to do that. And that really did hurt the American worker.
Oh, no question about it. There have been jobs exported. And not just to Mexico, to lots of other countries as well. That balance needs to be restored a bit, and it needs to be made not just free trade, but fair free trade. So if there is a new trilateral, we'll add an extra F. It'll be NAFFTA, North American Fair Free Trade Agreement.
When you talk about the border wall, when you talk about the idea that America first, what kind of a reaction do you get from your counterparts in Mexico?
Well, the border wall is not my department. As you know, my friend and business partner, Richie Lafrac, is very involved with the president on that score and infrastructure in general. So the wall is not really part of our activity. Our activity is to try to deal with the anomalies that exist in NAFTA and update it. Remember, this is an old agreement. You really didn't have much of a digital economy back when it was starting out. You didn't have a lot of service industry activity that we have now, and that's so important to our country. So it's at worst outdated, and there are lots of features that were wrong. For example, they limited the country of origin rules to a certain percentage of individual automotive parts. Well, that might have sounded very clever at the time, but half those parts aren't even used in cars anymore because automotive technology has moved on. So there are lots of imperfections of that sort that we need to fix. And along the way, the purpose will be to reduce our balance of payments deficit while increasing total trade.
It feels like the president has begun to warm to some kind of a tax at the border, whether it's a border adjustment tax, a so-called reciprocal tax, which we spoke with Stephen Mnuchin about, the Treasury Secretary, a couple of weeks ago. And yet, it's complicated. I spoke with an automaker the other day who said to me, look, we have parts that go into our cars, components, that cross the border 7 times. Maybe there are certain components that have to go into the seat, and the seat is produced in Mexico, and then it has to come back, and then the assembly line is in the U.S. How do you figure out what the levy should be when you've got components crossing the border several times?
Well, first of all, the administration has taken no position on the border adjustable tax. We're still studying it. And the part of the reason we're still studying it is it is very complicated. You'll find anything to do with trade is infinitely complicated because one size doesn't fit all. The issues of automotive are not the same as the issues of agriculture. They're not the same as the issues of electronics.
Or steel.
Or steel. Right. It's a very, very complicated situation. So it's very hard to paint just with one big, broad brush.
So, I mean, would you do something more reciprocal then? If India charges us 70%, we'll charge them 70%. If China charges us 100%, likewise.
Well, we don't buy and sell the same products to each of those countries. Our largest source of trade deficit is probably the automotive industry, counting parts and all the subcontracting that goes into it. So that's one whole topic. One of our big net exports is agriculture. And yet we're still denied agricultural access to many markets around the world. So that's my point, that each segment and practically each product within it, say within agriculture, corn's issues are not the same as sugar's issues. soybeans issues are different from either corn or sugar. Same within manufacturing, same within services. So you have to deal very precisely product by product and country by country.
Your priorities, you've said right now, Mexico, Canada, and Japan?
Well, Japan is a very, very large trading partner. It's very, very important to show that we're not disengaging from that part of the world. And Japan is not only historically a very important trading partner, it's also historically a very important defense partner. And particularly with a lot of the turmoil going on in the Asian area right now, it's especially important that people understand that we are together with our Japanese friends.
Do you have confidence that you will be able to get all of this done, and then a tax package, including potential taxes? We don't know what they will look like. I recognize you haven't committed to anything at the border yet, but in 2017, you'll get these things done, you think?
Well, we'll try our best, but the more important thing than the exact date is to get it right. And one of the dangers in multilateral negotiations, because they are so complex, is people get too invested in making a deal as opposed to making the deal. We're not going to fall into that trap.
All right, we'll be watching. Secretary Ross, good to see you. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Secretary Wilbur Ross there. The so-called Sheriff of Wall Street, New York prosecutor Preet Bharara, says he's been fired by President Trump after he refused to step down. But is he just grandstanding? Our panel's coming up, and we'll take a look as we look ahead of the important week's events this week. Back in a moment. Sweep out Obama administration holdovers by ordering the resignation of 46 U.S. attorneys late Friday. High-profile New York prosecutor Preet Bharara wasn't having it. He was one of them, but he says on Twitter, "I was fired after refusing to step down." We want to bring in our panel on that. Ed Rollins, former White House advisor to President Reagan. Susan Ferrecchio is with us, Washington Examiner, chief congressional correspondent. Good to see you both. Thank you so much for joining us. What do you make of Preet Bharara?
This is not unusual. Usually they replace the 93 that are the U.S. attorneys across the country. He's been an exceptional U.S. attorney. He's done a wonderful job. But there'll be someone else come in and do it's a new administration. And I think the key thing here is he was always kind of Schumer's guy. And I think if I was the president or the Justice Department, I'd want my own person there. People
are all wondering what happened with the cases that were on Preet Bharara's desk.
They're still there, and there's an acting and there's an outstanding U.S. Attorney's office here, one of the best in the country, and I'm sure the ones that are valid will continue.
Susan, if this is so commonplace that a new president comes in and he does a sweep, he or she wants their own people in there, then why is he grandstanding and sending out Twitter notes? "I was fired. I didn't want to leave."
Well, he was invited to Trump Tower in November, and he was given assurances that he would stay on. I think what changed is the leaks and sort of subversive tactics within Trump's administration has, I think, provoked this sort of purging you're seeing right now, where I think they're feeling like they need to put all their own people in layers and layers down into the government, not just at the secretary level, because they need to stop the leaks coming out that really are undermining Trump's presidency. And Bharara is trying to argue, hey, they told me I could stay. But really, it is common for these guys to be replaced or ladies to be replaced once we have a new president.
Implications of this?
Well, I think the short term, I think obviously because it's New York and the high profile that he's had, a lot of people are going to think it's nothing but politics. The U.S. attorney is a political position. It's a very important position. But my sense is in a month you'll have a new person suggested, and you'll continue to move forward. And I think that he himself is a political person and may very well run for another office, as did Giuliani and as did Christie, who were two U.S. attorneys.
And Sally Yates also protested when she, as acting attorney general, was fired, but she was very clearly an Obama loyalist.
Right, and people are feeling like maybe Preet Bharara was also an Obama loyalist.
Well, he was Schumer's counsel. He was Schumer's recommendation, and I think to a certain extent, and again, I'm not saying anything bad about him because I think he was a tremendous U.S. attorney. It's just you want your own team there, and particularly with all the things that are going on in one of the most important districts, you know, where the president is going to spend a lot of time in New York and has his family here. You want your own person.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of priorities, we know President Trump's priorities, but you wonder how the U.S. attorneys are going to shift their priorities as a result of this.
They all do with a new administration and a different party in place. People could make arguments that the DOJ under Obama I heard this all the time on Capitol Hill, was acting as a political agent and not as a neutral arbiter.
Oh, we all know that they're politicized.
And they are. And so you would expect with the new administration for the agenda to change. And I really think that you're going to see that happen under Jeff Sessions.
Which is why, by the way, Jeff Sessions was in an interview last week with Hugh Hewitt, and he basically said, yeah, I would encourage a special prosecutor to look at the Obama administration scandals, like the IRS targeting scandal, like Fast and Furious. I wonder if that comes up.
I think those are all very important. The one thing I do hope they don't do is appoint a special prosecutor. I mean, I think that proved to go on forever, and you have no control. I think you have a Justice Department that, with a new administration, they can go after anything they think that was illegal or improper, and you have an investigative committees in the Congress, as you had Senator Blunt on earlier. They need to look at these things. They need to look at the Russian things. They need to look at all these charges that are out there and come to some conclusions.
But not if it's going to affect the agenda that they've got on their table. We'll take a short break. When we come back, we'll talk about that. Is there a divide growing among Republicans over the health care bill to replace Obamacare? More with our panel as we look ahead right now on Sunday Morning Future. Stay with us. Welcome back. President Trump working hard to fulfill his campaign promise to repeal and replace Obamacare, but some big-name conservatives are not on board. Back with the panel right now, Ed Rollins and Susan Ferrecchio. Let's talk budget for a moment, guys. We're getting the budget out on Wednesday. Are they going to be able to do what they want to do while also repealing and replacing? They don't have the votes for the current bill.
The budget that's coming out this week is sort of resetting their priorities. The budget process is a very long, tedious process, and it really won't matter. What does matter is the CBO estimates tomorrow on the health care cost. They have to win the health care. He doesn't win the health care battle at this point in time. There's a long ways to go. It's going to be very difficult to get any of his other priorities. So it's all hands on deck. They got to make that happen.
Well, one question that I just asked Steve Scalise was the idea that how much did it actually cost? Because sources are telling me that the Obamacare legislation cost $1 trillion more than the CBO.
That was a good question that you asked him too, and notice, you know, it was $1 trillion more. And if you go back and look at the amended CBO, everything changed along the way with Obamacare, because CBO, which is the Congressional Budget Office, they're supposed to be nonpartisan. They have a hard time figuring out how many people are going to participate when you develop a new health care law. That's the problem. So already the Republicans are saying, well, the CBO score will come out, but look, in the past it's been wrong. So there's a big question about how reliable it's going to be, whether it is pro or against what the Republicans are proposing. But it's coming out tomorrow, and I really suggest here that it will force them to make some changes. And the Speaker Ryan said that last week. When we get a look at the CBO, we may have to make some changes to it to help make it revenue neutral and, you know, make sure there aren't a million people getting kicked off.
To be successful and get it to both the House and the Senate, they're going to have to make some adjustments, and there's nothing wrong with that. That's the congressional process.
And it's part of what Trump likes to do. He likes to negotiate.
Art of the deal.
Right, and I think this week you're going to have the most conservative faction of the House caucus going to the White House for bowling. Things like that are going to happen. The president's going to Nashville on Wednesday. He's going to be the salesman, the big pitchman for this. And I think it's going to be a combination of bartering, making some changes to the bill, striking a deal, and the president going out and selling it.
Some people say that they took money from all sorts of agencies to pay for Obamacare, like Fannie and Freddie. I mean, that's been circulating all weekend.
I'm sure they did. I will tell you something. Having served in a couple of White Houses, this team inside is doing a very effective job. They're not doing as good a job on the communication side, but the congressional relations side, taking members over there, stroking them. The president has been very, with real access. He's out selling the program, and that's going to be very important.
He's a deal maker. We got a big week, guys. We'll be watching. Great to see you both.
Thank you.
Thanks so much, Susan. Good to see
you. Is the only referee that we're able to use, that we're allowed to use, so you have to go with their numbers. But I think it's important to look historically. They've been off on health care estimations a lot over the years, I would say, and on other things, but that's the scorekeeper you have. Under Obamacare, they said it was going to reduce the deficit. It increased it. Under Obamacare, they said it was going to lower costs. Cost increased. Regardless of that, we know our bill is going to lower the deficit. We know our bill is going to give families the choices that they want to make in health care. But also, the CBO cannot look at all the other things that we're doing. They can't look at what Secretary Tom Price can and is doing over at HHS. They can't look at the other bills that we're going to move, like allowing people to buy insurance across state lines. So you have to look at this package in totality to look at how it's going to actually restore health care freedom for families, put them in charge of their decisions, and ultimately lower costs for premiums, which is most important to families that are struggling under the ballooning, skyrocketing increases in health care that we're seeing under Obamacare.
What's the answer to Rand Paul saying that this is more Medicaid expansion?
Well, first of all, we actually give flexibility back to the states in Medicaid. It doesn't affect Medicare. But Medicaid, we transform that system. If you look, probably the most broken form of health care is Medicaid. For decades, conservatives have been saying we want to actually restore flexibility to governors so that states can run the Medicaid program instead of this one-size-fits-all Washington model that's failed. We do that in this bill. It's a revolutionary conservative reform. You know, maybe some people want to stick to the old Medicaid system.